The word hit Violet Wells like a slap across the face, sharp and deliberate, thrown across the crowded floor of Hatcher's General Store on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882. Proud. Edna Fulton said it loud enough for every woman in that store to hear, loud enough for the bolts of calico fabric to absorb it, loud enough for it to bounce off the glass jars of penny candy and settle into the sawdust floor like something permanent. Edna stood with two of her closest companions, Martha Briggs and the widow Carolyn Holt, and all three of them watched Violet with the particular kind of satisfaction that comes from a long time waiting to say something out loud. "The proudest woman in Calico Creek," Edna continued, adjusting the ribbon on her bonnet as though she were discussing the weather. Too proud to accept a helping hand, too proud to smile at her neighbors, too proud to admit that running a ranch alone is beyond what any decent woman should be attempting. Violet stood at the counter with her list in her hand, her back straight, her jaw set, her dark eyes fixed somewhere above Edna Fulton's head at a point on the wall where a calendar advertised Arbacle's coffee. She did not turn. She did not flinch. She had been weathering this particular storm for 18 months, since the day her father, Clement Wells, had died and left her the deed to 300 acres of scrubland and grazing land on the eastern edge of the Calico Creek Valley, and she had refused, in front of the entire town, to sell it to Preston Hatcher, who happened to be the brother of the man who owned this very store. She had said no clearly and without apology, and Calico Creek had never quite forgiven her for it. Harold Deeds, the storekeeper, set her flour and her salt on the counter without meeting her eyes. His discomfort was visible in the way he counted her change twice, then a third time, pressing each coin into her palm like a small, inadequate apology. Violet gathered her parcels, signed her name to the credit ledger in her clean, deliberate handwriting, and walked out of that store with her chin level and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. She loaded her supplies into the back of the buckboard, untied her mare from the rail, and sat for one moment on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her gloved hands. The street of Calico Creek moved around her in its ordinary Tuesday way. A freight wagon rolled past. Two men argued outside the land office. A dog lay in the shade of the barber shop awning, blinking at the dust. No one looked at her. That was its own kind of cruelty. She clicked her tongue and drove her wagon out of town, and she did not cry until she was well past the bend in the road where the cottonwood trees closed over her like a canopy, and no one could see her face. That was the morning Oscar Keller rode into Calico Creek for the first time, though Violet did not know it yet. She would find out later, in the way things find you in a small valley where gossip travels faster than weather, that he had arrived at almost the exact moment she was leaving. She would learn that he had watched her buckboard disappear around that cottonwood bend with something he could not yet name moving in his chest, something that had to do with the particular set of her shoulders, the straightness of her spine, the way she handled those reins with the calm authority of someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to be easy. But all of that came later. First, there was the ranch, and the debt, and the trap that was closing around her without her full knowledge of how tight it had already become. The Wells Ranch sat at the foot of a long, shallow ridge that ran northeast to southwest, splitting the valley's eastern grassland from the scrub cedar breaks where deer bedded and coyotes hunted at dusk. Violet's father had built the main house from adobe brick and timber 30 years before, when this part of Texas was still wilder than it was settled, and the house still stood with the square, stubborn permanence of something made by a man who believed in permanence. There were two corrals, a barn that needed its southwest corner post replaced, a root cellar dug into the base of the ridge, and a kitchen garden enclosed by a picket fence that Violet had painted white the previous spring, because she had decided that beauty was not a luxury, even if everyone in Calico Creek seemed to think her peculiar for believing so. She ran 212 head of cattle, a small remuda of 8 horses, and employed 2 hands. Their names were Bertram Cross, who was 61 and had worked for her father for 20 years, and a 19-year-old named Toby Garland who had shown up the previous winter asking for work and turned out to be an exceptionally gifted horseman despite having the common sense of a young retriever. They were loyal. They were competent. They were not enough. The trouble with the ranch was not the cattle or the land or the labor. The trouble was the note. Clement Wells had borrowed $1,100 from the Calico Creek savings and loan in the spring of 1880 to purchase the breeding stock that now formed the foundation of Violet's herd. He had made his payments faithfully, and the note was due in full in the spring of 1883. What Violet had not known, what her father had not told her in the months before his death because he had believed firmly that worrying women was ungenerous, was that he had arranged a verbal agreement with the bank's primary investor, a man named Arden Cole, that in the event of his death, the note could be extended in exchange for Cole having right of first refusal on the property. Arden Cole was Preston Hatcher's business partner. Violet had discovered this arrangement 4 months after her father's death, when Arden Cole arrived at her door on a cool April evening with his hat in his hand, and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and explained the situation with the patient, careful tone of a man who expects to get what he wants and is simply waiting for you to understand the inevitability of it. He told her she had until April of 1883. He told her the land was worth more than the note, considerably more, and that he was prepared to be generous. He told her that a young woman alone, a young woman without family or prospects, would find the arrangement beneficial. Violet had listened to all of it. Then she had told him, politely and precisely, that she intended to pay the note in full before its due date and that she had no interest in his arrangement and that he was welcome to see himself off her property. The smile had flickered. Something harder had moved behind his eyes, brief and cold as a shadow crossing sunlit ground. He had replaced his hat, thanked her for her time, and ridden away. That had been 6 months ago. Since then she had sold off a portion of her beef, kept her expenses as low as she could manage, driven her own cattle to the sale barn in Millbrook 40 miles east rather than pay a drover's fee, negotiated directly with the Mexican landowner to the south, Senor Delgado, for water access that kept her summer grazing costs down. And still she was $400 short of what she needed, and she had 6 months left to find it. The pride people talked about was not pride. It was precision. It was the refusal to be careless with her own survival. It was the knowledge that one wrong step, one moment of softness or dependence or misplaced trust, and everything her father had built would belong to Arden Cole and Preston Hatcher, and she would be left with nothing but the kind of sympathy that people offer freely because it costs them nothing. She arrived home that Tuesday afternoon and unhitched her mare and carried her supplies into the house, and stood for a moment in her kitchen with her hands flat on the pine table, staring at nothing, letting the silence of the house hold her. Then she put water on for coffee and went out to check on the southwest corner post of the barn, which Bertram kept telling her needed replacing, and which she kept putting off because lumber was not free. That was when she heard the hoofbeats on the road. There were 2 riders, and she recognized Bertram's bay immediately, so she was not alarmed. The second rider was a stranger, tall in the saddle, on a dark sorrel horse that moved with the quality that comes from good bloodlines and good handling. He rode with the ease of someone who has spent years in the saddle, not the performative ease of a man trying to look comfortable, but the genuine, unself-conscious ease of a man for whom a horse is simply an extension of thought. Bertram pulled up at the fence gate and leaned on his saddle horn. "Violet," he said, using her given name as he always had, with the familiarity of a man who had known her since she was 8 years old. "This here is Oscar Keller. He rode in this morning from over in Kerr County. Come to me at the feed store while I was getting your salt order straightened out. He is looking for work." Oscar Keller swung down from his horse in the smooth, unceremonious way of a man who does not need to make an entrance. He was 30 years old, though Violet would not know that for some days. With dark brown hair worn shorter than most men in the valley and honest, direct brown eyes that took in the ranch with one slow, comprehensive sweep before they settled on her. He was broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with a face that had spent considerable time in weather, the kind of sun-hardened competence that could belong to any number of Western men, except that there was something else in his expression, something careful and watchful and serious that separated him from the ordinary run of drifting cowboys. He removed his hat. "Miss Wells," he said. His voice was low and even. "I am sorry to show up without warning. Bertram mentioned you might have need of an extra hand." Violet looked at him for a moment. She had learned to look carefully. "Where in Care County?" "Ingram. I had a position there for 3 years. Before that, Uvalde County. I can give you the names of both ranchers if you want references. I'm a fair hand with cattle and a better-than-fair hand with horses. I can work wire, I can work timber, and I am not afraid of a long day." She studied him. He did not fidget under her gaze. He did not look away or look at Bertram for rescue. He simply stood there and let her look, which was itself a kind of quality she did not often encounter. "I cannot offer much in wages right now," she said, deciding to be direct because she was always direct, and because she was tired of the particular exhaustion that came from managing other people's discomfort with directness. $40 a month and board. If the ranch is in a better position come spring, I will do better by you." Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "That is fair," he said. "You will bunk with Bertram and Toby in the hands' quarters. We start at first light. You will want to know the ranch before I can use you properly, so your first 2 days are orientation." She paused. "Is there anything I should know about you, Mr. Keller? Any reason I might regret hiring you?" The question was blunt and she knew it. He considered it honestly, which she appreciated. "I left Ingram because the owner's son came back from 2 years in San Antonio with ideas about the ranch that I did not agree with and that were going to get horses hurt," he said. "I told him so. He did not take it kindly. I would rather you hear that from me than from anyone who might put a worse face on it." Bertram, still on his horse, made a small sound that might have been approval. "Very well," Violet said. "You can put your horse in the near corral. There is hay in the barn and oats in the bin on the right side. Welcome to the Wells Ranch, Mr. Keller." She went back into the house without looking back at him, but she heard the sound of him leading his horse toward the corral, and she stood for a moment at the kitchen window with her coffee mug warming her hands, watching him move through the late afternoon light with that quiet, unhurried efficiency. And she noticed for the first time in a long time that she was not thinking about the debt or the note or Arden Cole. She was thinking about the way he had stood there and let her look at him without flinching, without performing, without any of the defensive posturing that men usually deployed when a woman examined them that carefully. She went back to her accounts and did not think about it again. The first week passed in the rhythm of ranch work, which is its own kind of mercy because it does not leave much space for the luxuries of feeling. Oscar proved immediately and without fanfare that he was exactly what he had said he was. He could work wire and he worked it well, replacing the down section along the south pasture fence in a single long day that would have taken Bertram 2. He had a genuine gift with horses that Toby, who worshipped at the altar of horsemanship, recognized within the first afternoon and responded to with the transparent admiration of the very young. He was quiet at meals, spoke when he had something to say, and did not fill silence with unnecessary noise, which Violet appreciated profoundly. He also did not treat her as though she were a problem to be solved. This was rarer than it should have been. Most of the men who passed through Calico Creek, most of the men who had any dealings with the Wells Ranch since Clement's death, operated from the baseline assumption that a woman running a ranch alone was a temporary situation awaiting correction. They offered advice she had not asked for. They second-guessed her decisions in the particular gentle way that is actually not gentle at all. They told her what her father would have done, as though her father's methods were scripture and her own judgment was at best a substitute and at worst an imposition. Oscar Keller did not do any of these things. He executed her instructions completely and well. When he had a question, he asked it plainly. When he had an opinion, he offered it once and then dropped it without nursing grievance when she did not adopt it. He was, she realized at the end of that first week, a thoroughly professional man in the precise sense that the word should imply, someone who brought his full competence to his work and his full respect to the person who directed it. It was not until the second week that she began to notice the other things. The way he was with her mare, Clara, who was 17 years old and had developed a stiffness in her left hindquarter that Violet worried about. She came out one evening to find Oscar in the near corral with Clara, not doing anything dramatic, just standing beside her with his hand moving in slow circles on the stiff joint, talking very quietly. She could not hear the words. She stood at the fence for longer than she should have, the way he laughed. She heard it for the first time at supper on the 8th day when Toby, attempting to describe an incident involving a contrary steer and a mud hole, somehow tangled himself so thoroughly in his own story that the ending was incomprehensible, and Oscar laughed, a real laugh, sudden and warm and completely unguarded, and the sound of it moved through the kitchen like something that belonged there. The way he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, not with the hungry, assessing quality that she had learned to recognize and deflect, but with something more complicated and more careful. Something that looked, if she was honest with herself, like seeing. She did not permit herself to think about it directly. She had a note coming due, and a ranch to save and no space in her life for complications. The complication, however, was proceeding on its own schedule. 3 weeks after Oscar's arrival, Arden Cole rode onto the Wells property. He came on a gray Thursday morning when Violet was in the north pasture checking on the herd, and he spoke first to Bertram, who came to find her with an expression that said everything before his mouth did. She found Cole waiting at the front gate, his horse tied to the rail, his hat on his head this time rather than in his hand, which told her the courtesy was being dropped. He was a broad, florid man of 52, red-faced from a lifetime of whiskey and sun, with the particular assurance of a man who has always had money and has confused that fact with virtue. "Miss Wells," he said, "I wanted to give you an update on the situation regarding your father's note." "I am aware of the situation, Mr. Cole," she said. "Then you are aware that you are currently in a position of some difficulty." He spread his hands in a gesture of reluctant sympathy that was entirely performed. "I have spoken with the bank. They have agreed to my terms for the note purchase. As of the 1st of November, I will hold the paper on this property. I want to give you ample time to consider your options." Violet felt the trap close another inch. "You purchased the note." "I have arranged to purchase it, yes, which means the terms of repayment will be renegotiated through my office rather than the bank." He paused. "I am still prepared to be generous, Miss Wells. You are a capable woman. I respect what you have attempted here, but capability is not always enough." She was aware, without looking, that Oscar had come to stand at the corner of the barn. She could see him in her peripheral vision, still, watching, but she did not look at him because this was not something she needed rescue from. This was something she needed to navigate with her own words and her own composure. "Mr. Cole," she said, "if you hold the note, then you hold the note, and I will honor the original terms of repayment because those terms are what I agreed to and what the legal instrument specifies. I will have the full amount by the spring deadline. Good day." Cole looked at her for a long moment with that flat, cold assessment. "You are a stubborn woman." "I am a precise one," she said. He rode away. She stood in the yard until the sound of his horse faded, and then she turned and walked toward the barn because she needed to be moving and she needed to not be standing in the open looking as though she had just been shaken. Oscar was there, repairing a harness at the workbench, or appearing to be. He did not turn immediately. "That man means you harm," he said, without looking up from the leather in his hands. "I know what he means," she said. "Do you have a plan?" She stopped. It was not a patronizing question. It was not an offer to step in front of her and handle it. It was a plain question from a man who understood that she was the one with the plan, and he was asking whether she had won, because he was trying to assess how he might be useful. "I need $400 before April," she said. "I have a steer buyer coming in December from San Antonio who will take up to 50 head at a fair price if the cattle are in good condition. If I push the grazing through the fall well, I can put 50 head before him that he will pay well for. That gets me within $100, the shortfall I have not yet solved." He nodded slowly. "Your remuda," he said. "That gray gelding with the blue eye, how old is he?" "4. "He is the finest moving horse I have seen in this part of Texas," Oscar said. "I know a man in Fredericksburg who breeds for the cavalry and buys quality horses at premium prices. I could write him. That gray could bring 150, possibly more." She looked at him properly for the first time in this conversation. "That gray is not for sale." He met her look. "I know. I am telling you he could be if it came to it and what he would bring. That is all. The decision is yours entirely." She held his gaze for another moment. "Write your man in Fredericksburg," she said. "Not to sell, to know the number. Information is not a commitment." Something very quiet moved across his face. It was not a smile exactly, but it was adjacent to one. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to the harness. She walked out of the barn into the thin October sunshine and stood there with the wind coming down from the ridge and her heart doing something she had no name for and no patience with at present. He had not told her what to do. He had brought her a number and called it a number and left the decision exactly where it belonged, in her hands. In 18 months of running this ranch alone, no one, not Bertram, not the banker, not any of the well-meaning neighbors who had turned up with casseroles and quiet suggestions in the weeks after her father's death, had managed that particular grace. She went back to work. She had cattle to check. October moved toward November in the way of Texas autumns, which are not so much a season as a negotiation. Warm days and cold nights and sudden, brief storms that arrive from the northwest with genuine conviction and depart before you have finished being surprised by them. The ranch moved through its rhythms, and Violet moved through her days with the focused economy of someone running a race against a deadline she could see, but that others could not fully appreciate. Oscar had settled into the operation with a completeness that had stopped feeling temporary. He and Bertram developed the comfortable working shorthand of two experienced men who trust each other's judgment, and his effect on Toby was measurably positive, the young man working with more purpose and less flailing now that he had a model to emulate who was not 61 years old. The southwest corner post of the barn got replaced. The south pasture fence was entirely sound. The cattle were gaining well on the late grass. What Violet had not expected, what crept up on her with the stealth of something she had not thought to guard against, was the habit of conversation. It started practically. After supper in the evenings, she spread her accounts on the kitchen table, and twice Oscar had come to the door to ask about something to do with the next day's work, and twice she had answered and he had stayed. And by the third time it was simply understood that the hour after supper was a time when they talked. About the ranch at first. The condition of the herd, the state of the fences, the prospects for the winter grazing. Then about other things. He told her about Kerr County and the 3 years in Ingram, about the horses he had worked with there, and the methods he had developed for gentling difficult animals. She told him about her father, about learning to read cattle before she could properly read words, about the summer she was 12 when a drought had nearly finished the ranch and her father had sat on the porch every evening with his hands on his knees, not speaking, just watching the brown sky for clouds that did not come, and how she had understood then that loving a piece of land was not a gentle thing, that it asked everything of you and offered no guarantees. He listened to her the way people rarely listened, with his whole attention, not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but actually receiving what she said, sitting with it, responding to it. She could not remember the last time someone had listened to her like that. She noticed other things she should not have been noticing. The way the lamplight fell on his face in the evenings. The way his hands moved when he was thinking. A particular slow interlacing of his fingers that she had catalogued without meaning to. The quality of his silences, which were never uncomfortable, never charged with the social anxiety that makes most silences hard to sit in, but simply present, simply real. She was 31 years old and she had not been in love before, or near it. She had been engaged once briefly, at 26, to a man named Jeffrey Marsh who had turned out to want a housekeeper with better social credentials than he could hire. And she had understood this clearly enough to end it before it became a disaster. And he had gone away confirming to everyone in Calico Creek that she was, yes, too proud to make a reasonable match. She had decided after that to stop apologizing for what she was and to invest her energy in the things that deserved it, the ranch, the cattle, the careful stewardship of something her father had built with 30 years of weather and work. And now this man was sitting at her kitchen table 4 nights a week talking about horses and weather and the price of beef, and she was in very serious trouble and she knew it, and she was not, for the first time in her life, entirely sure she wanted to avoid it. The night everything shifted, it was the 2nd week of November. She had been going over the cattle count for the December sale and was not happy with the numbers. She was short 8 head from what she needed, because 3 of the steers she had counted on had proven unready, still carrying rough condition from a late summer illness that had moved through the herd in August. She sat at the kitchen table with her pencil and her ledger and the arithmetic that would not come out the way she needed it to, and when Oscar knocked at the door and came in and looked at her face, he said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled out his chair, sat down, and said, "Tell me the exact number." She looked up. "What?" "The exact number you are short, not approximately. Exactly." She told him. He was quiet for a moment and she watched him work through something in his head. "Señor Delgado," he said, "south of you. When I rode down to check the fence line last week, I saw his south pasture. He is not running as many animals as he has the grass for. He would have late-season steers." "I know Delgado," she said carefully. "Would he sell to you?" "I do not know. We have the water arrangement which has been good, but I have never bought cattle from him." "His son was driving a small bunch to water when I was there," Oscar said. "Good animals. If you went to him and explained what you needed, 8 head of decent steers you could finish for the December sale, he might accommodate you. At the right price, it is profitable for him too." Violet set her pencil down. "You have been thinking about my problem," she said. He met her eyes steadily. "I work here," he said. "Your problem is a problem I am part of." The simplicity of it undid something in her chest. She had spent a year and a half being very carefully alone in this problem, very carefully not asking for help, because asking for help had always come with conditions she did not accept. And here was this man saying, "Your problem is a problem I am part of," as though that were the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" she said, and it came out more quietly than she intended. He did not pretend to misunderstand the question. "Because you are running this ranch with more skill and more intelligence than most men I have worked for," he said, "and you are being squeezed out of it by people who do not deserve it, and I find that difficult to sit with." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down off the ridge with the cold edge that meant a real front was coming. Inside, the lamplight made everything small and warm and close. "There is something else," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, more careful. "I want to be honest with you because I think you prefer honesty and because you deserve it." He stopped. She waited. "I find myself thinking about you when I am not in your company," he said. "I find myself thinking about the way your mind works and the way you approach things and the way you care about this place. I'm not telling you this to complicate your situation, which has enough complications. I am telling you because not telling you felt dishonest, and I think the worst thing I could do to you is be dishonest." The room was very quiet for a moment except for the wind. Violet looked at him for a long time. She thought about Edna Fulton saying proud across the crowded general store. She thought about Jeffrey Marsh and his housekeeper ambitions. She thought about every person in Calico Creek who had looked at her and seen a problem or a challenge or a lesson in what happened when a woman got too many ideas about her own capability. She thought about Oscar Keller standing in the yard the morning Arden Cole had come, still and watchful and not rushing forward to handle it, just present, just there, trusting her to handle her own life. "I think about you too," she said. "I wish I had more space in my life right now for thinking about it properly." Something crossed his face, warm and careful and entirely real. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything right now except permission to feel what I feel without having to hide it." "You have it," she said. He nodded once and then he said, "Ride down to Delgado's with me tomorrow. Let us solve your numbers." And just like that, they were back in the practical, and the practical had somehow never felt so much like a love story before. They rode to Senor Delgado's the following morning, the two of them together, through the cold, bright air of a Texas November morning with the frost still on the grass. Rodrigo Delgado was a man of 55 who had ranched this valley longer than almost anyone. A Mexican landowner who had held his property through the turbulent years after the Republic and the annexation and the war. A man of deliberate dignity and considerable intelligence, who received them at his gate with the measured courtesy of someone who has learned that most guests arrive with an agenda worth examining before being welcomed too warmly. Violet introduced Oscar simply, as her ranch hand, without apology for bringing him, and Delgado's eyes moved between them once with a subtle, private assessment that arrived at something amused. They negotiated across a pine table in Delgado's cookhouse, with coffee and pan dulce, in the businesslike and courteous way of two people who have an ongoing arrangement and understand each other's position. Violet explained what she needed. Delgado thought about it, asked several sharp questions about her December buyer, and arrived at a price that was not cheap but was fair, which was the best she had any right to expect. She bought 8 head. Riding home in the early afternoon with the arrangements settled and the paperwork to be drawn up the following day, she felt something she had not felt in months, a loosening of the particular tension around her breastbone that had been her constant companion since April. It was not solved yet. It was closer to solved. "Thank you," she said. Oscar looked at her sideways from under the brim of his hat. "You did the work," he said. "I knew a man had steers." "You thought about my problem," she said, "when it was not your problem to think about." "I told you," he said quietly, "it is my problem too." They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was full of things neither of them said. And when they came into the yard and dismounted and began to unsaddle in the easy parallel way of two people who have worked beside each other for weeks, the ordinary choreography of it felt suddenly extraordinary, this simple fact of not being alone in a difficult thing. November deepened. The reply came from Oscar's contact in Fredericksburg, a man named James Putnam who bred horses for the cavalry. He offered $160 for the blue-eyed gray gelding, sight mostly unseen, based on Oscar's description, with the provision that he would want to inspect the animal in person. Violet read the letter twice. She did not sell the gray. She filed the letter in her desk and knew what she knew. The front that had been threatening came through in the 3rd week of November with genuine force, a 2-day cold rain that turned to sleet on the 2nd night and left the landscape silver and hard-edged. Oscar and Bertram spent both days on horseback, pushing cattle to the protected lower pastures, breaking ice on the water tanks, doing the cold, miserable essential work of protecting a herd in weather. Violet was out with them for the first day, and Bertram made her go in on the second, not by telling her to, which would not have worked, but by saying that someone needed to be warm and thinking clearly when the hands came in, and that the coffee and the fire and the hot food mattered as much as the riding, and that he was going to feel better about riding into the sleet if he knew there was something worth riding back to. It was the most eloquent appeal Bertram had ever made, and it worked. She spent that 2nd day inside, keeping the stove going, cooking beans and cornbread and the salt pork she had put up in October, and when they came in at dark, wet through and chilled to the bone, she fed them at the kitchen table, all three of them, Bertram and Toby and Oscar, and the kitchen was full of warmth and the smell of food and the comfortable noise of men who have done hard work together and are glad to be finished. Oscar caught her eye across the table at one point, just for a moment, and the look held nothing improper and everything true. December arrived with the San Antonio buyer. His name was Frederick Alcott, a compact, businesslike man of 40 who drove a fine buggy and wore a suit that had been expensive several years ago and had been very well cared for since. He arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed to be Violet's most consequential day of the week, and she met him in the yard dressed for business, which meant her best wool skirt and her father's sheepskin coat and her good boots, and she shook his hand with a firm grip that made him blink once before he settled into the inspection. Oscar and Bertram brought the cattle through in groups of 10, while Violet answered Alcott's questions with the precision that came from knowing every animal in her herd by sight and by history. Alcott made his notes. He asked about the illness in August, which she told him the full truth of, and he examined the recovered animals carefully and was apparently satisfied. They settled on 46 head, because Alcott passed on 2 of the Delgado steers that he found light, and at a price that was better than Violet had allowed herself to hope for, $18 a head for the best of them and $15 for the others. She did the arithmetic on the buggy seat where she had invited him to sign the bill of sale, and she looked at the total, and then she looked at the ridge to the northeast of her property and took one very quiet breath. She was within $80. After Alcott left after supper, after Bertram and Toby had gone to the hands' quarters, she sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic again and then again, and it was still the same. She was within $80 of saving the ranch, with 4 months left before the deadline. Oscar came to the door. He must have read something in her face through the window, because when she let him in he said, "Good news or bad?" "Good news," she said. "Better than I expected." She told him the number. He sat down across from her, and the look on his face was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated, something like the expression a person makes when they have been worried about a thing for a long time and the worry has finally been given permission to ease. "You are going to make it," he said. "I need $80 more. You have 4 months and a ranch and a full herd. You will make $80. She looked at him. "I have been holding something very tightly for a very long time," she said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to put it down even briefly." He looked at her with that particular quality of his attention, full and steady and entirely serious. "You can put it down," he said. "For this evening. It will still be here tomorrow." She put her elbows on the table and covered her face with her hands for a moment, not crying, just breathing, just allowing the tension to exist outside her body for a few seconds instead of in it. When she lowered her hands, he was still there, still watching her with that honest, careful look that she had come to depend on in a way she had not planned for and was no longer trying to undo. "Oscar," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I mean it precisely and without drama." She stopped, finding the words, which was unusual for her because she was generally good at words. "I have been alone in this for a long time, not just since my father died. Before that, in the particular way that people who think differently from the people around them are alone even in company. And you are the first person I have encountered in a very long time who has made me feel not alone. I do not say that to burden you with responsibility for my feelings. I say it because you deserve to know." The room was very quiet. "Violet," he said, and her name in his mouth had a quality she had not heard it have before. "I want to say something back to you, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it." She nodded. "I have ridden through a lot of this country," he said. "I have met a great many people, and I have never met a woman like you. Not in the way people say that to mean something vague and flattering. I mean it specifically. I mean the way your mind works, the way you love this land, the way you handle hardship without either collapsing under it or pretending it is not there. The way you are honest even when it costs you. The way you are kind to your animals and fair to your men and relentless about the things that matter. He paused. Everyone in Calico Creek says you are too proud. When I look at you, I see the finest woman I have ever seen, and I want you to know that. She sat very still. The lamp burned between them. Outside, December was cold and clear and full of stars. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She had never in her life made the first gesture. It felt entirely right. His hand turned under hers and held on. They sat like that for a long time, not saying anything else, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest could wait for time to catch up with it. It was January before he kissed her, and it happened the way most true things happen, not dramatically but inevitably, on the front porch after an evening of planning the spring cattle schedule. When the cold had arrived and she had pulled her coat close, and he had said good night, and neither of them had moved, and the night had been very still, and he had looked at her for a moment with everything plain in his face, and she had looked back with everything plain in hers. And the distance between them had simply ceased to exist. It was a careful kiss, unhurried, real, the kind that does not announce itself with performance but simply arrives as a statement of fact. When they separated, he kept her face between his hands for a moment and looked at her in the starlight. "I intend to court you properly," he said, "in whatever way you will accept." "I will accept most things that are honest," she said. He smiled, a full, unguarded smile that was quite different from the one she had seen before, bigger, warmer, entirely without reservation. She decided at that moment that making him smile like that was something she intended to do regularly. January passed in the sweet, strange, suspended way of new love that has not yet been named publicly, the two of them still professional in the daylight in front of Bertram and Toby, though both older men had apparently drawn their own conclusions weeks ago, and managed to say nothing about it with the diplomatic expertise of people who know better than to comment too early. In the evenings, things were different. There was a new texture to the conversations, a new ease, a new willingness to be known that felt like something opening rather than something risked. He told her about his family, his parents in Careville, his father a carpenter who had built half the houses in that town and his mother who had taught school there for 20 years. He had 3 brothers, all working trades, none of them drawn as he was to the ranching life. He had come to cattle work at 17 and found in it something that answered a question his life kept asking him, some need for the combination of skill and weather and animals, and land that the carpenter's bench or the school room could not supply. She told him things she had not told anyone. The precise nature of her grief when her father died, not the simple sadness of loss but the complicated grief of an only child who had been her father's partner and confidant, and who had felt not just bereaved but structurally altered. The fear she had not admitted to herself in the first months, the genuine, bone-deep fear that she would fail and the land would go, and there would be nothing left of the man whose entire life had been poured into it. The loneliness that was not about the absence of company but about the absence of someone who truly saw her. "He would have liked you," she said one evening, meaning her father. "I would have wanted him to," Oscar said. In February, the question of the remaining $80 resolved itself with the careful inevitability of things that are supposed to happen. Toby, who had been improving steadily under Oscar's influence, won $20 at a legitimate horse race in Millbrook that Violet had given him permission to enter on the ranch's fast quarter horse. Violet sold 2 bred heifers she had been holding back at a favorable price to a new settler in the valley who was starting his own herd and could not afford full-grown cattle. The ranch's winter expenses were lower than she had projected because Oscar had found a supplier in Fredericksburg for oats at a price considerably better than what Harold Deeds had been charging her. By the 1st of March, she had the full amount and $40 more. She wrote a letter to Arden Cole. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. It was brief and entirely precise. It informed him that she would be delivering the full amount of the note, plus interest, to his office on the 15th of March, and that she expected to receive the satisfaction of mortgage at that time. She signed it Violet Wells, with no title and no pleasantries. She showed Oscar the letter. He read it and handed it back to her. "Perfect," he said. "I want you to come with me," she said. "Not to manage it, just to be there." "I will be there," he said. She sent the letter the following morning. Cole's response arrived 4 days later. It was longer than hers and considerably less precise. It mentioned her father's arrangement in vague terms. It suggested the paperwork might require some additional time to process. It offered again, for the final time, to discuss the purchase of the property at a price that would leave her comfortably situated. It did not say no to her payment. It simply tried very hard to make her uncertain. She read it once and set it aside. On the 15th of March, she rode into Calico Creek with Oscar beside her and the banknotes in her saddlebag in an envelope she had sealed herself. The morning was cold and bright, the particular brilliant clarity of a Texas March morning when the winter is done, and the air is clean and everything looks possible. She wore her best clothes and she sat straight in her saddle, and she did not hurry. Main Street was doing its Tuesday business when they rode through. She saw Edna Fulton outside the milliner's shop, and Edna saw her, and the woman's eyes moved from Violet to Oscar and back, with the rapid, recalibrating attention of someone revising a story they have been telling themselves. Violet did not stop. She did not acknowledge the look. She kept riding. Cole's office was in the back of the land agency building on the second cross street. She tied her horse at the rail, took the envelope from her saddlebag, and went inside. Oscar came with her as far as the outer door, where he stood with his hat in his hands, solid and present. The meeting with Cole lasted 18 minutes. She knew the exact number because she had checked the clock on his wall when she entered and again when she left. He tried several things in that 18 minutes. He tried to question the accuracy of her count. He tried to suggest there were additional fees. He tried to delay the satisfaction paperwork on the grounds that his attorney needed to review it, and she put on his desk the legal text of the promissory note, which she had read very carefully and had brought with her, showing him the specific language that required satisfaction on full payment with no provision for attorney review. He looked at the paper for a long time. Then he signed. She walked out of that office with the satisfaction of mortgage in her hand, and Oscar saw her face before she had gotten fully through the door, and whatever was in her face made him stand up straighter with something very bright in his eyes. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. Then he did something she had not expected. He put his hat back on and he said, very quietly, "Your father built something worth keeping, and you kept it." She stood on the boardwalk in front of the land agency building in the middle of Calico Creek on a March morning with the mortgage satisfaction in her hand, and for the second time in her life she cried in public, just briefly, just a few seconds, just enough to acknowledge what it had cost and what it was worth. Then she folded the document carefully, put it in her coat pocket and said, "I want coffee." He laughed, that full, unguarded laugh, and said, "Let us find some." They sat in the small restaurant next to the hardware store, the one that Violet had never been comfortable in because it was where the town's social business happened, and she had not been welcome in its social business for the past 18 months. They sat at a table by the window and ordered coffee, and the restaurant owner, a woman named Agnes Bright, who had always been privately kind though never publicly brave about it, brought them 2 cups and a small plate of ginger biscuits that Violet had not ordered, and met her eyes with a small, warm nod that was its own kind of something. Edna Fulton came in while they were still there. She saw them at the table and stopped. There was a moment of the particular social reckoning that happens when 2 people who have been in a state of unspoken hostility find themselves in the same room at close range. Edna looked at Violet. Violet looked at Edna with a calm, level steadiness that was not hostile, was not triumphant, was simply there. "Good morning, Edna," Violet said. "Good morning," Edna said after a noticeable pause and went to her table. The morning was over. Calico Creek had seen what it had seen. Violet finished her coffee and walked out into the bright March air with the document in her pocket, and the man she loved beside her and the ranch behind her, free and clear and entirely her own. Spring came to the Calico Creek Valley in the usual gradual, beautiful way of Texas springs, the grass coming up green and thick in the low pastures, the bluebonnets moving up the south-facing slopes of the ridge like a purple tide, the cattle spreading across the new grass with the satisfied, leisurely purpose of well-kept animals who know where they stand. The ranch moved into its spring rhythm, with the calf crop arriving steadily through April, most of them strong and clean-legged, which told Violet that the breeding decisions she had made the previous spring had been the right ones. There was a conversation that happened in late April that she had been anticipating without knowing exactly how to begin it. She and Oscar were mending the fence along the north border on a warm afternoon, working in the easy, practiced parallel they had long since developed, when she said, without looking up from the wire, "There is something I want to ask you." "Ask it," he said. "You came here as a hand," she said. "You have been here 6 months. Your position has become something different from that, I think, at least in some respects. I want to know how you are thinking about your future." He set down his pliers and turned to face her. She put down her gloves and turned to face him. "I am thinking about it as being here," he said. "If that is something you want. I am asking because I want to be honest, and because I think there is a difference between a man who is passing through and a man who is staying," she said carefully. "And if you are staying, I want that to be a choice you have made fully and not just a thing that accumulated." "Violet," he said. Her name in his mouth still did the same thing it had done in December, which she had come to accept as one of the better facts of her life. "I left Ingram because I had nowhere I was pointed toward. I came here and found somewhere I am pointed toward. I am not passing through. I know the difference." She looked at him for a moment. "I am not easy to be with," she said, "because honesty required it. I have strong opinions and I am not inclined to surrender them without reason. I run this ranch and I intend to keep running it, and I will not be managed. I do not want to manage you," he said with absolute simplicity. "I want to be beside you while you do it." She took a very quiet breath. "Then I should like you to speak to whatever formalities are appropriate," she said, "because I want things to be properly done." The smile broke across his face like light through cloud, sudden and complete and entirely beautiful. "Are you asking me to propose to you?" he said. "I am asking you to do it in whatever way feels right to you," she said, "and I am telling you in advance what the answer will be." He walked the 2 steps between them and took both her hands in his and looked at her with everything in his face and said, "Violet Wells, I want to marry you. I want to help you build this ranch into something that could last another 30 years. I want to have the kind of evenings we have been having for the rest of my life. I want you to be my wife, and I want to be whatever you need me to be." "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He kissed her in the north pasture with the bluebonnets on the ridge above them, and the cattle watching with the placid indifference of animals who have better things to think about, and it was entirely perfect. They married in June. The wedding was small by the standards of the time and place, which was to say about 30 people in the yard of the Wells Ranch on a Saturday afternoon. Under the live oak tree that Clement Wells had planted the year he built the house, which had grown in 30 years to be large enough to shade a considerable portion of the yard. Violet wore a blue dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, a particular deep blue that matched the evening sky in that valley on clear summer nights, and she had spent more time on that dress than she was quite comfortable admitting. Agnes Bright from the restaurant came, which Violet had not expected. Several of the valley's ranchers came with their wives, men who had dealt with Violet in the business of cattle and water rights, and who had respected her competence even if they had been uncertain about her. Señor Delgado came with his wife and son, and he brought a bottle of very good wine and shook Oscar's hand with a gravity that amounted to approval. Edna Fulton did not come. Violet had not invited her. She did not intend to rewrite history in her own heart in order to appear magnanimous, and she had decided that she could practice charity in other ways. The minister was a Methodist from Millbrook named Reverend Sayers, a small, cheerful man who married them with the straightforward competence of someone who has performed the ceremony many times and still considers it the most important thing he does. Bertram stood up for Oscar, which made Oscar's face do something quiet and moved when Bertram offered. Toby, who had been polishing his boots for 2 days, stood in the front with an expression of ceremonial seriousness that was extremely young and entirely earnest. Violet walked out from the house and across the yard on her own, because there was no one to give her away, and she had decided that this was not a thing she was going to perform around. She walked to where Oscar stood under the oak tree, and the look on his face when he saw her in the blue dress was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. They said their vows. They were not elaborate. They were precise, because she had written her own and he had written his, and both of them were the kind of people for whom precision was a form of love. She promised to be honest with him and faithful to him, and to be his partner in whatever came. He promised to be beside her, to see her clearly, to never ask her to be smaller than she was. The party afterward was genuinely, unexpectedly joyful. Someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had a guitar, and the yard became something different from what it had been in the past 18 months of difficulty and struggle, something open and celebratory, and full of the particular happiness that comes from a hard season being over and a new one just beginning. Oscar danced with her under the oak tree in the early evening light with one hand at her waist and one hand holding hers, and she put her chin against his shoulder and felt the solidness of him, real and present and entirely hers, and thought about that Tuesday in October when Edna Fulton had called her proud in front of everyone in Hatcher's General Store, and she had driven home crying along the cottonwood-lined road. She thought about the ranch and the note and the arithmetic of survival. She thought about her father planting this tree 30 years ago when the land was harder and the future was less certain than it looked from here. She thought she would tell her father, if she could, that the ranch was safe, that she had found someone worth the particular risk of being known, that the bluebonnets came back every spring and the cattle were doing well, and the southwest corner post of the barn had been replaced and held solid through the winter. She thought he would have been glad. The summer that followed was the best summer Violet could remember in a long time, possibly ever. There was the work always, the ranch demanding its due in labor and attention, the cattle requiring the constant management that healthy animals require, the fences and the water tanks and the 1,000 small responsibilities that make up the daily life of a working ranch. But the work had a different quality now. It had a shared quality. It had the particular richness of things done in partnership, the way a burden divided between two people of equal will, and competence becomes not lighter exactly but more bearable, more meaningful, less the grind of survival and more the substance of a life being built. Oscar took on the horse breeding operation that Violet had been wanting to develop for 2 years, but had not had the time or the hands to properly pursue. He had the eye and the knowledge for it, and the blue-eyed gray gelding, who had never been sold, proved to be an exceptional breeding prospect in ways that were becoming visible in the first foals from his first season. James Putnam in Fredericksburg rode again, this time with a standing offer for any of Keller's stock horses that met his standards, and the letter addressed it to Keller horses without either of them having formally established that name for the operation. And Oscar showed it to Violet and said he thought they should decide what to call the horses they bred, and she said she thought Wells Keller had a sound to it, and he agreed. Bertram announced in August that he intended to retire the following spring, which he had been intending to announce for 3 years according to his own accounting, and had been putting off because there was always something that needed doing. He had a cousin in San Marcos who had invited him to come and be idol, which he described as a prospect he found simultaneously appealing and suspicious. He would be given a severance generous enough to make his retirement comfortable, which Violet had been setting aside for exactly this purpose for the past year. He left in April of the following year with his horse and his bedroll, and a new coat that Violet had bought him, and a handshake from Oscar that lasted about twice as long as handshakes usually do. They hired 2 new hands the following spring, brothers named David and Felipe Reyes, who came from a family in Uvalde County that Oscar knew from his years there. They were good workers and easy-tempered, and Toby, who had been the youngest hand for 2 years, took to having junior colleagues with the slightly overdone dignity of someone who has recently been promoted. Violet discovered she was expecting in the late autumn of 1883, and the knowledge arrived with the particular complexity of something that is entirely wanted and entirely daunting in equal measure. She told Oscar on a November evening at the kitchen table, because that was the place where the most important things had always happened between them, and she said it plainly, because she said everything plainly, and what happened to his face was something she had not had words for before and found she did not need words for now. He came around the table and held her with the kind of care that is not fragility. That is the care a person offers something precious without making it smaller. And she put her forehead against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time in the warm lamplight of the kitchen, while the wind moved across the ridge outside, and the ranch settled into itself around them. The baby was born in July of 1884, delivered by the doctor from Millbrook, who arrived on horseback with commendable speed, and departed with equal speed after establishing that both mother and child were entirely well. He was a boy, strong and loud and indignant about existing, which Violet found completely reasonable. They named him Clement for her father, with Oscar's middle name Joseph as a second name, and they called him Clem. Clem was approximately 4 months old when he was first carried out to see the ranch on a warm October morning, in his mother's arms, while his father walked beside her and pointed things out with the particular earnestness of a man who wants his son to understand about horses from the very beginning. The cattle were visible in the south pasture, slow and golden in the autumn light. The bluebonnets were long past, but the goldenrod was out along the fence lines, bright as a claim. "This is your grandfather's land," Violet told Clem, who was regarding the landscape with the unfocused intensity of very young infants encountering large spaces. "He built it for 30 years, and I kept it for you." Clem expressed no opinion on the matter but tightened his grip on her finger with the unreasonable strength of the very young, which she took as sufficient. Calico Creek over those 2 years had shifted in its relationship to Violet Wells, or Violet Keller as she was now known in the records, though she kept Wells in use because she was Clement Wells's daughter and the land bore his name on the original deed, and she was not in the business of erasing things that deserved to exist. The shift was not dramatic. It did not involve apologies or public admissions that anyone had been wrong. It was smaller and more real than that. It was the way that Agnes Bright always found a good table. It was the way the new bank manager, a young man named Hartley who had replaced the old one, consulted her about cattle prices when buyers came through because she was generally the most accurate source in the valley. It was the way that several of the younger women in the valley, women in their 20s who were running households and managing more than they were credited for, found reasons to speak to her when they could, listening to the way she talked about her ranch and her decisions, and her life with a careful attention that told her something about what they were looking for. She was not the most popular woman in Calico Creek. She did not expect to be. But she was respected, which was the thing that had always mattered more to her, and she had come to understand that the respect was not despite who she was but because of it. Edna Fulton remained distant, which Violet found she could accept. The world was large enough to contain people who did not understand each other, and she did not require Edna's understanding to live well. Preston Hatcher and Arden Cole made one final attempt in the spring of 1884, which was so poorly executed that it was almost insulting. Cole sent a letter suggesting that a technical irregularity in the original deed transfer might cloud Violet's title, which was entirely fabricated, and was dispatched by the same attorney in San Antonio that Oscar had recommended she retain the previous year, a woman named Margaret Alcott, no relation to the cattle buyer, who had studied law in Missouri and had moved to Texas and set up a practice, and who handled Cole's letter with the calm, surgical precision of someone who has dismantled more impressive arguments than this one. Cole did not write again. Hatcher continued to run his store. The world moved on. There was an evening in the autumn of 1885 when Violet and Oscar sat on the front porch of the main house, the house that Clement Wells had built from adobe and timber, and that now had a new porch addition that Oscar had designed and built himself over 2 winters, extending the sitting space along the east face of the house, so that they could watch the evening come up from the ridge and the last light go gold across the valley. Clem, 14 months old and newly mobile, was inside in the care of a girl from the valley named Rosa who came 3 afternoons a week, and whose presence Violet had accepted after a lengthy internal negotiation, with the part of herself that considered asking for help a form of admission. The valley was quiet. The cattle were in the lower pastures. The horses stood at the fence of the breeding corral in the companionable rows that horses arrange themselves in when the day is done. The blue-eyed gray, 4 years older and considerably more distinguished, stood at the end of the row with the particular composure of a horse who has always known he was exceptional. "What are you thinking?" Oscar said. She considered the question honestly because she always answered his questions honestly. "I am thinking about that October morning when Bertram brought you through the gate," she said. "I did not know who you were or what was going to happen. I was very tired and very worried, and I was trying not to show it." "You showed it a little," he said. "I know, you saw it." "I saw you," he said. There was the particular simplicity in those words that she had come to recognize as the most precise way he had of saying the truest things. She leaned her shoulder against his and felt him settle his arm around her in the easy, complete way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the two of them knowing exactly where they were and being entirely glad to be there. The ridge caught the last of the light, going from gold to copper to a deep, warm brown, and the first stars came out above it, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way of things that are deeply, properly, sustainably alive. "Oscar," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it." "Always," he said. "I was not unhappy before you came," she said carefully. "I want you to know that. I was managing. I was surviving and building and working towards something I believed in. I was not sitting somewhere waiting to be found." "I know," he said. "But this is better," she said. "This is so much better than what I knew how to want." He turned and looked at her in the last of the evening light, and the look on his face was everything she had come to expect and still somehow more than she had learned to take for granted. "It is," he said. Clem's voice drifted out from inside the house, the particular declarative vowel sounds of a very young child, announcing his continued existence to the universe. They both heard it and both smiled the involuntary, unreserved smile of parents who find their child's noise entirely welcome regardless of the hour. "Our son has an opinion," Oscar said. "He comes by that honestly," Violet said and stood up. They went inside together, into the warm and lamplit house, through the kitchen where the pine table held its accountable surface, and the stove put out its steady heat. And the baby who was named for a man who had loved this land was holding both arms up toward whoever would come. And both of them came. And the house was full of the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a family that had been built from choices made well, from honesty held to under pressure, from the particular courage of people who refuse to be less than they are regardless of what the world is willing to receive from them. Outside, the ridge went dark against a sky that was deepening toward full night, star after star finding its place in the dark, and the valley settled into the quiet breathing of land that has been carefully kept. And the Wells Ranch, standing on its 300 acres of scrub and grassland at the foot of the eastern ridge, was entirely, permanently, irrevocably home. The spring of 1886 brought a second pregnancy, which Violet discovered in February and greeted with somewhat more equanimity than the first, having established by now that her body knew what it was doing, and that the doctor from Millbrook could be summoned reliably, and that Rosa was worth her weight in considerably more than she was paid. Oscar responded with the same quality of careful, genuine joy, and Toby, when he was told, turned red to the ears and congratulated them with the sincere formality of someone who considers the Keller household a thing he has a personal stake in. This baby was a girl born in October, named for no one in particular but named well, Josephine Clara Keller, for Oscar's father's sister, and for Violet's old mare, in that order of sentiment. Clara the mare was 20 years old and spending her days in comfortable retirement, having been formally excused from work the previous spring in a ceremony that was unofficial but felt necessary. Josie, as the baby was almost immediately called, arrived without the elder Clem's dramatic complaint about existence, and seemed from the first hours to be conducting a calm survey of the household. Clem, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone who has been the primary resident, and is revising his spatial assumptions. Within a week they were coexisting in the manner of small children who are yet too young for genuine rivalry but old enough for parallel entertainment. And the house, which had been quiet and adult for so long, was now in possession of the particular soundscape of a house with children in it, which is to say consistently audible and intermittently chaotic and entirely, completely worthwhile. Señor Delgado came to see the baby, as he had come to see Clem, and held Josie in his broad, careful hands with the expression of a man who has grandchildren of his own and knows precisely how to hold a new life. He stayed for supper, and he and Oscar talked about the horse breeding operation until late in the evening, while Violet fed the baby, and listened to them from across the room and thought about the 4 years since the October day when Bertram had brought Oscar through the gate, and everything had been debt and difficulty, and the grinding loneliness of fighting alone. She thought about her father. She thought about what she had built on what he had built. She thought about the fact that this valley, this house, this table, this family, was a living argument against everyone who had told her she was too much, too proud, too precise, too unconventional, too alone. She was none of those things. She was exactly what she had always been, which was entirely herself, and it had turned out that being entirely yourself was not a limitation, but the only real foundation anything worth building could stand on. The years moved forward in the way of years on working land, measured in seasons and calf crops, and the incremental changes of a place that is deeply attended to. The south fence line extended when Violet bought the adjacent 40 acres from a departing settler in 1887. The breeding operation expanded to 15 broodmares by 1888. Toby Garland promoted to foreman at the ripe age of 25, and taking to the role with a seriousness that suggested the retriever energy of his youth had been converted entirely into professional competence. Clem at 5 was already following Oscar around the corrals with the focused, absorbing attention of a child who has found his subject. Josie at 4 had opinions about the kitchen garden that she expressed with remarkable force and volume, and that generally proved correct once you deciphered them. There were plans, drawn on paper and discussed at the kitchen table on winter evenings, for a larger barn on the north end of the property, and a proper breeding shed, and a second well. The town of Calico Creek grew, slowly and unevenly in the way of small Texas towns in that era, new families arriving, old disputes shifting, the social landscape rearranging itself around new facts. Agnes Bright expanded her restaurant. A newspaper started up, then stopped, then started again. A second church was built. The school that had been operating out of the Methodist Fellowship Hall moved into its own building, and Violet donated lumber for the floor, which she did quietly and without making a speech about it, because the point was the floor. She walked through that town differently than she had in 1882. Not with performance, not with the conscious armor of someone expecting attack, but with the settled ease of a person who knows where she comes from and what she has built and does not require external confirmation of either. People greeted her. She greeted them back. She was still direct, still precise, still disinclined towards social performances that had no substance behind them. But the edge was different. The edge that had once been the edge of someone bracing for the next blow was now the edge of someone who has fought her fights and knows her ground and is simply, genuinely, continuing to live. One afternoon in the summer of 1888, she was in Hatcher's General Store, which she still patronized because it was the most convenient supply point in the valley and she was a practical woman, when Edna Fulton came in. It was not a Tuesday. It was a Thursday, which perhaps explained why neither of them had planned for it. They were the only two customers in the store at that moment. Edna looked at her and Violet looked at Edna, and there was a very long pause in which Harold Deeds found something urgent to attend to at the far end of the counter. "Mrs. Keller," Edna said. "Mrs. Fulton," Violet said. Another pause. Edna was older than she had been, something in her face less certain than it once was, the particular edge that had sustained the cruelty of that October morning in 1882 worn down somewhat by time and perhaps by circumstances Violet did not know. "I heard your mare passed," Edna said, "the old one." Clara had died the previous spring, at 21 years old, in the meadow below the ridge on a warm April morning, quietly and completely, as good horses sometimes do. Violet had sat with her until it was over. She had not spoken of it much, but she had felt it with the full weight of feeling something that is both animal and memory and time. "She did," Violet said, "in April." "I am sorry for it," Edna said, and the apology, or what it stood for, seemed to extend some distance beyond the horse, into a territory that neither of them was going to name directly but that both of them could acknowledge existed. "Thank you," Violet said, and meant it. They did not become friends. That was not the story. But they nodded at each other on the street after that with the nod of two women who have agreed, without words, to put something down and leave it where they put it. And that was its own kind of resolution, and Violet accepted it. The new barn was finished in the autumn of 1889, and they had a raising party for the completion of it that was larger than the wedding had been. Nearly 60 people in the yard on an October afternoon, with food and music and the particular expansive goodwill of a community gathering around something built well. Oscar stood beside Violet at the edge of the crowd at one point and looked at the new barn and the old house and the corral full of well-bred horses and the children running through the yard and the valley stretched out below the ridge in its October gold, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said at last. She felt the weight of the words settle into her with the fullness of something that has been waiting a long time to arrive. She found his hand beside her and held it. "I think so too," she said. "Now." The life they had built was not simple, because nothing on working land is simple, and nothing built by two strong-willed honest people is simple, and nothing worth having ever truly is. There were years of good rain and years of drought, good calf crops and difficult ones, the ordinary and necessary negotiations of a partnership between two people who each had convictions, and who had agreed from the beginning that honesty was not optional, and that the kitchen table was the place where hard things got said. There were evenings where they disagreed sharply about ranch decisions, and said so clearly, and found their way through to something neither had seen from their separate vantage points. There were nights when one of them was frightened about something, weather or illness or the terrible vulnerability of caring about a piece of land, and a family in a world that offers no guarantees. And the other was simply there, steady, present, the particular solidity that is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stay beside it. What there was, consistently and without diminishment, was the thing they had started with, the thing that had been stated clearly at a kitchen table in December of 1882 over a lamp that burned between two people who had decided to be honest with each other and had never stopped. The thing that had survived note payments and cattle sales and the death of a beloved old mare and the arrival of children and the passage of years on difficult land. Clem, at 8 years old, was the finest young horseman in the valley and showed every sign of becoming something special, which Oscar observed with the satisfaction of a man whose deepest competence is being passed forward. Josie, at 6, had decided that she wanted to learn to read the cattle the way her mother did, by eye, by movement, by the collective body language of a herd, and Violet was teaching her on horseback with the quiet patience of someone who was taught this same thing on horseback by her own father 30 years before. The ranch had expanded to 500 acres, carrying 400 head of cattle and 20 broodmares, and the progeny of the blue-eyed gray, who had lived to 17, and whose sons and daughters were running now from Fredericksburg to San Antonio, with the particular quality of movement that James Putnam had been willing to pay premium prices for, and had, for the past 5 years, been putting into the hands of cavalry riders who brought back favorable reports. The Calico Creek Valley moved through its seasons, and the Wells Ranch, now the Keller Ranch in common usage though the original deed still said Wells on the title and always would, moved through its seasons too, and the two things were inextricably bound because that is what it means to love a piece of land long enough and well enough. You become part of its counting, part of the way it tells time. On an October evening in 1890, 8 years almost to the month from the afternoon that Oscar Keller had first ridden through the gate behind Bertram Cross, Violet sat on the extended porch of the main house and watched the last light leave the ridge. The children were inside with the lamp and their books. The horses were at the fence. The valley was gold and quiet and entire. Oscar came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and she took it and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her in the easy, complete, permanent way that had been theirs for 8 years, and still felt like a fact she was grateful to discover every time. "I was thinking today," she said, "about that morning at Hatcher's store. When Edna Fulton called me proud." "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking that she was not entirely wrong," Violet said. "I was proud, I am proud. I am proud of this place and what it cost and what we made of it. I am proud of the work." She paused. "I just think the word was meant to be diminishing, and it was not that either." "No," he said quietly, "it was not that." She held her coffee in both hands and watched the stars find their places above the ridge, one and then another, and then the sky full of them. The particular extravagance of a clear Texas night with no moon, all that light falling on the valley and the land, and the house that Clement Wells had built, and that his daughter had kept, and that had been home to everything worth having for as long as she could stand to count it. "Thank you," she said, and did not need to say for what. "Thank you," he said back, and did not need to say for what either. Inside the house, Clem said something to Josie that made her laugh, a high, pure sound that moved through the window and out into the evening air, and joined the noise of the crickets and the wind and the far-off lowing of the cattle in the lower pastures, all of it together making the sound of a life that was full and real and built on foundations that would hold. The ridge held the last copper light for 1 more minute and then let it go, and the stars were everything, and the valley was theirs, and they were each other's, and that was more than enough. That was everything.